Good morning, everyone. We're going to start in just a moment. We had about 200 people register. And so once we see that the attendees coming up, we'll start the work group. So just hold on tight. All right, it looks like the rate of the attendees is slowing down. So what I'll do is I'll go through the beginning, and as people jump on, we will provide more information. Thank you all for participating in today's public work group to discuss the clean mobility investment projects in the fiscal year 2022-23 update to the 3-year plan for clean transportation equity investments. I'm Sam Greger. I'm a manager at the California Air Resources Board, and I work as part of a great team of staff and managers who are trying to move the needle for light duty vehicles and equity throughout California. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. We do anticipate a copy of the recording to be made available on our low carbon transportation investments and air quality improvement program meetings and workshops page in about 2 weeks. So as I just mentioned, this is part of the fiscal year 2022-23 funding plan for low carbon transportation and air quality investment or improvement program funds. This is one of a series of work groups to start the process to provide information on the progress that we've made, lessons learned, and get participation and feedback from stakeholders throughout the state. This year, the governor's proposed budget that came out in January for low carbon transportation it is really exciting. It's added a lot more money than we've seen in previous years to light duty ZEV and community projects. Approximately $419 million has been budgeted for the community equity projects that we'll be talking about today. Another $506 million has been budgeted for light duty ZEV projects such as the vehicle purchasing incentive programs, CVRP, Clean Cars for All, and that was introduced in a workshop last week. So this work group is one of many that we're going to be holding over the next few months. It's really to start the conversations and ask the right questions so that we can get as much participation in helping us make funding plan proposals so that we can bring it to our board later this year. Thus far, no decisions have been made on what we plan on doing yet, but we're looking forward to the discussion. Next, I'll go through some just logistical things. Materials for today's work group, including the agenda and slides, are available on the webpage I mentioned earlier. We'll also put a link into the chat. We will be using Zoom's raised hand and Q&A box features to facilitate comments and questions, and directions are provided on the slides for each comment period as a reminder. And if there are any Zoom disruptions for any reason, technological issues, anything malicious, we will immediately end today's meeting and send out another notice for rescheduling it. Also, we cannot allow anonymous meeting participants for security reasons. So please make sure your name is clear on the Zoom platform. If you want comments or questions to be submitted in writing, please feel free to use the Zoom Q&A feature, and we'll try to address as many verbally as we can. And again, thank you all for participating today. We're really excited And with that, I'll pass it on to Ashley and Bree to walk you through the agenda and the presentation.
Thank you, Sam. My name is Ashley Giorgio, one of the lead staff implementing clean mobility equity projects in communities and developing the long-term plan for clean mobility equity investments. I'm joined by Bree Swenson, who's the lead staff for the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project and one of my thought partners in co-creating the Mobility Long-Term Plan. We do have 2 hours for discussion today with a lot to cover, but we will be mindful of our timing and preserve the comment periods as much as we can. If there are specific areas of interest or questions and concerns, please do enter them into the Zoom QA. Even if they go beyond what we have time to adequately address, we'll follow up accordingly after the work group and also consider topics where additional information may be needed to provide at future work group meetings or one-on-one discussions as well. There will be deliberate pauses for comments and questions between our topics here today. We want to hear your ideas, we want your feedback, and really want to understand how you think CARB should move forward with our clean mobility investments over the next 4 years and beyond. We will kick off today's conversation with clean transportation equity investments background and highlights, including information on regional clean mobility options projects and other clean mobility investments. We'll then open it up to comments and questions, followed by an introduction of the fiscal year 2022-23 long-term plan. We'll provide an overview, including the 4-year plan requirements, as well as budget projections and additional considerations for this process. We will discuss a few 4-year plan elements we're seeking feedback on to help lay the groundwork for development, including preliminary objectives, the community outreach and engagement process, metrics to evaluate program outcomes and community benefits, and facilitate comments and questions between each of those topics. We'll conclude today with information on upcoming meetings and next steps. Okay, so today marks the first of 3 work groups to support development of a long-term plan for clean mobility equity investments. There are 2 critical pieces to the long-term plan based on Senate Bill 1275 requirements, which are intended to be as complementary as possible. The first is vehicle purchase incentives and the zero-emission vehicle market. There was a workshop on that portion of the plan on February 10th, and more are planned through the spring of this year. The second portion is focused on clean mobility equity projects and outreach-related activities, and that's the focus of today. We have staggered timing of our long-term plan meetings leading up to the final funding plan workshop later this summer, which I'll discuss later. Today's work groups intended to start the long-term plan process for clean mobility equity and outreach-related efforts, including workforce training and development and technical assistance and capacity building. We do have specific questions we'd like everyone to be thinking about, which we are happy to follow up on outside of this discussion today. The governor's fiscal year 2022-23 draft budget, as Sam mentioned, is $419 million over 4 years, marking the first multi-year proposal in the history of our mobility projects. Really exciting. And it's also signaling the importance of building a thoughtful plan for how and where funding should be spent. So CARB has worked to develop clean mobility equity investment approaches that pay increasing attention to the role investments play in promoting racial equity and racial justice. We want to be deliberate and incorporate transportation equity into our decision-making from the start, consistent with what the Governor's Office Zero-Emission Vehicle Market Development Strategy mentions in their pillars, but also ongoing guidance from the communities themselves and our advocates. Incentives have a critical role to play. They support meeting the unique needs of communities, which has been a historical challenge. We all know this for transportation projects. The intent is to support and prioritize community-driven solutions and multi-sector approaches, such as promoting clean transportation in schools, statewide projects to increase mobility options, and access key destinations. We evaluate projects to build on the successes of past investments and incorporate lessons learned. We're further refining and enhancing our metrics and evaluation strategies as part of the fiscal year 2023 funding plan process, which is in line with recommendations from the California State Auditor. We want to support communities in the state's economic recovery as well through investing deliberately in job training and workforce training and development programs. Addressing mobility needs that go beyond personal vehicle ownership to reduce emissions and vehicle miles traveled consistent with Senate Bill 375 goals, especially in areas of the state where communities don't have the same level of access and face increasing burdens of transportation costs, is really a priority. We will be describing project focus or benefits with the specific definitions that I provided here, so just wanted to make sure they're clear. Priority populations are communities that are economically disadvantaged, exposed to multiple sources of pollution, and especially vulnerable to pollution and climate change. They're the focus of our climate investments and our clean mobility equity projects. Disadvantaged communities are the top 25% of communities in CalEnviroScreen, and they're experiencing disproportionate impacts. Low income and communities and households have incomes at or below 80% the statewide median, or below a threshold designated low income by the Department of Housing and Community Development. Under-resourced is defined as smaller communities that have less capacity, community leader support, or funding experience or funding to apply for clean mobility projects and struggle to compete with some of our larger entities. We've developed the Clean Mobility Options Voucher pilot and also the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project to help address these needs. Socioeconomic benefits are critical elements of clean mobility investments, and they differ between projects depending on the goals and intended outcomes. For mobility, the focus is on priority population access to goods and services, key destinations, and other opportunities as well.
I was muted. Good start. All right. Thanks, Ashley. I'm Bree. Ashley introduced me earlier. So clean mobility investments are increasingly important to meet the dynamic needs of California's communities. And as Ashley mentioned, although accelerating purchases of cleaner vehicles and expanding turnover of existing vehicles is important, California ultimately needs planning and mobility strategies that shift the nature of our transportation system, especially in lower income communities that lack clean transportation choices. CARB's clean mobility investments focus on these systems change needs, and if expanded in future years, could play an even more important role in transitioning our transportation system. CARB's clean mobility investments cover many pilots that you may be familiar with, but first we want to rewind and give you a brief history of how we got where we are. So CARB has funded clean mobility investments since the first two car sharing solicitations in fiscal year 2014-15 and 16-17, and learned a lot from these early pilot projects about the benefits from and challenges with funding clean mobility projects. Based on stakeholder input on the need for more investment supporting agricultural workers, CARB created the Agricultural Worker Van Pool pilot and released the solicitation in fiscal year 16-17. In the first two competitive car sharing solicitations from the last slide, CARB learned that the competitive process made it challenging for smaller projects and smaller, less resourced communities to successfully compete for funding. So in fiscal year 17-18, CARB developed the Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program to pilot a different approach to clean mobility investments. The Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program funds a statewide administrator to provide smaller scale clean mobility project vouchers on a first come, first served basis. CARB had also been hearing from stakeholders that there needed to be more streamlined access to and outreach for some of the state's consumer-based incentives. Based on this input, CARB funded a statewide administrator to develop Access Clean California, formerly One Stop Shop. The pilot focuses on clean vehicle purchase incentive projects such as Clean Cars for All and financing assistance for lower income consumers. In 2017 and 2018, CARB also led a public process to develop the SB 350 Barriers Report. Through this process, CARB worked with stakeholders to identify barriers to accessing clean transportation and provided recommendations to inform the state's clean mobility investments. For example, The barriers report highlighted the importance of conducting community transportation needs assessments and investing in workforce training and development programs to ensure investments meet the unique needs of each community. In fiscal year 18-19, CARB allocated funding to a new Clean Mobility in Schools pilot project. Based on SB 350 and stakeholder input about meeting the unique clean transportation needs of kindergarten through 12th grade school districts, and a desire to increase the awareness and exposure of youth to clean technology. Also in 2018, CARB published the first SB 150 progress report, which CARB is required to write every 4 years to discuss progress related to the Sustainable Communities Act, or SB 375. CARB's report identified an urgent need to reduce vehicle miles traveled to further the state's climate and equity goals. A new SB 150 report will be going to the legislature later this year, and we recommend monitoring CARB's SB 375 webpage for more information on that process, and I believe Ava is going to put a link to that webpage in the chat. During fiscal year 1920, CARB started taking more concrete actions to encourage and fund community transportation needs assessments based on those recommendations from SB 350. CARB allocated funding to a new pilot program called the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project, or STEP, which is intended to provide more flexible, larger scale, and community-led investments to address community-identified transportation needs. CARB also piloted funding community transportation needs through both STEP planning and capacity building grants and the Clean Mobility Options Voucher pilot program's Community Transportation Needs Assessment vouchers. Prior to fiscal year 21-22, CARB had already supported workforce development in clean transportation, both through funding workforce development programs in STEP and in clean mobility in schools, and through encouraging local hiring in the Clean Mobility Options Voucher pilot program. CARB was also developing deep relationships with the California Energy Commission, the California Workforce Development Board, and other state and local agencies to support workforce development. But fiscal year 21-22 was the first year that CARB identified specific funding in the funding plan for workforce development based on recommendations in the SB 350 report and consistent stakeholder input, which really highlighted the need to further dealership training for new and used zero-emission vehicles and the need to partner with adult and vocational education programs. In fiscal year 21-22, CARB also continued to fund and support our active clean mobility pilots. All right, so that is a brief history of CARB's clean mobility investments. We'll be going over each of the active pilots, Clean Mobility Options, STEP, Clean Mobility in Schools, and others in more detail after this. But before we do, are there any comments or questions on the history that we've covered so far and where we got where we are?
Thanks, Bree. Looking for any raised hands. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A. And I think we'll go to those. I'm not seeing any raised hands. Our first question comes from Loretta. Our rural county received a Caltrans Sustainable Communities Planning Grant to study mobility options for our hard-to-serve remote rural communities that are not easily served by traditional transit. Will this program fund the alternatives that the study will develop?
I think it's a good question, and I think it's our goal to be able to fund the types of projects that communities identify that they need. So we'll want to keep engaging with you and make sure that we're meeting that goal. We don't have, as you'll see, later on in this presentation, we don't actually have a set vision or a proposal for what the program is going to look like in the future. We want to create that with stakeholder input, including yours.
Sean, I'll address the next four.
Okay.
By Mark Roast and Aditya Sharma. I apologize if I mispronounced your first name. The questions that you are asking are targeted towards our heavy duty incentives. This particular work group is focused on personal transportation and mobility. So what I'll do is I'll provide some links into the responses and send them back directly to you, because we're not focusing on the heavy duty side of our incentives. But thank you for participating. Oh, there is also another off-road heavy duty work group going on right now, which you may have thought that you were participating in. I'll put the link to that into the chat.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A or raised hands. I think we can move on.
Sounds great. So regional clean mobility pilots have provided a critical foundation for understanding the clean mobility landscape of priority populations. I will cover a few examples and highlights here. Our community car share provides zero-emission car sharing and mobility subsidies for Sacramento affordable multi-housing and other communities. The project is working to expand from 8 to 10 affordable housing sites this year. Car sharing and mobility hubs and affordable housing is a multifaceted Bay Area project that will provide clean mobility options, including zero-emission car share, transit subsidies, and ride-hailing services in Oakland, Richmond, and San Jose. Ecosystem of shared mobility is focused on serving the unique needs of rural Tulare and Kern counties by providing zero-emission car share and a mobility application called Vamos to connect users to key destinations in the communities of Arvin, Lamont, Wasco, and Visalia. Liftline Paratransit focuses on the needs of the elderly and disabled communities, providing Americans with Disabilities Act shuttle replacement in Santa Cruz County community of Watsonville. We're currently implementing 2 fiscal year 2014-15 projects, including Blue LA Car Share and our community car share in Sacramento. We have 3 active fiscal year 2016-17 projects, including Liftline Paratransit, car sharing and mobility hubs, and ecosystem of shared mobility. Valley Air ZEV Mobility is inactive as of January of this year due to the initial COVID-19 shutdown and subsequent lack of demand. Project partners are examining, however, the data and plan to share lessons learned. The agricultural worker van pools project is not operable due to technology limitations with agricultural worker vehicle applications. This project has been critical, though, in elevating and better understanding needs of rural farm worker communities, which will be a consideration for future investments. Regional clean mobility options projects were selected based on a competitive grant solicitation process. In the spring of 2015, there was a first solicitation resulting in the selection of Blue LA and our community car share. These projects spurred innovative ideas and methods as well of increasing transportation access in 2 of California's largest metropolitan cities, LA and Sacramento. Fiscal year 2016-17 projects resulted from releasing a new solicitation in the spring of 2017, focused on meeting unique mobility needs, such as mobility hubs, e-bikes, transit on demand. It incorporated a rural focus of our investments as well as more inclusive of under-resourced communities. Agricultural transportation projects were eligible in fiscal year 2014-15 in that car share solicitation. And after hearing the desire for dedicated funding to support these unique needs, we released the agricultural worker van pool project. All of these projects and the solicitation process itself garnered key lessons which will be applied on a continual basis, but they also resulted in the creation of Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program, Clean Mobility in Schools, and the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project. One key element of clean mobility investments is data collection. We're making a concerted effort to share this data and promote transparency in project benefits and outcomes, both the inputs of what and how we measure, and outputs to show whether the intended goals were met. We developed a new project user page, which assists with this effort. More work is to come, however, to streamline access to project information. Key data elements for regional clean mobility projects include the number of communities that were served, as well as the total number of zero-emission vehicles and other mobility options available. Based on this data and the analysis of the lessons, we've determined the need for a statewide clean mobility options voucher pilot program.
All right, so I'm going to now go over 3 of our active pilots, and then I'll pass it back to Ashley. So we're going to start with the statewide Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program. In partnership with the California Energy Commission, the Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program provides funding for clean shared transportation options, including zero-emission car sharing, van pools, electric and regular bicycle sharing, scooter sharing, and ride-hailing services in the state's most under-resourced communities. As we think about this program in the context of the long-term plan, it's important to remember the goal is to serve those historically marginalized and left out of transportation decision-making. And this will continue to be a goal that shapes the future of all of CARB's clean mobility investments. The Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program awarded 24 needs assessment vouchers and 20 mobility project vouchers in its first application windows in 2020, which were quickly oversubscribed. We anticipate the second application window will include a total of at least $16 million, $15 million to be made available for mobility projects, and $1 million to be made available for community transportation needs assessments. This slide provides some data on the Clean Mobility Options vouchers, including total funds allocated to the project, the number of projects funded, greenhouse gas emission reductions, the level of investment in communities to meet our AB 1550 and SB 535 goals, and the number of zero-emission vehicles and other mobility options made available through these funds to date. The Clean Mobility Options website provides maps that show the locations of the projects and descriptions of awardees. CARB anticipates the second application window for this program to be open in late spring or early summer, but staff are currently waiting for the AB 1550 disadvantaged community designations to be finalized and approved by Cali PA before releasing the new implementation manual and finalizing plans for opening the application window. Updates to application materials will be based on lessons learned from the first application window and a lot of input from different stakeholders, awardees, applicants, community organizations, and others. There will be a lot coming up for this pilot, so please make sure you're monitoring the Clean Mobility Options website over the next few months if you're interested. All right, so moving on to Clean Mobility in Schools. This is a pilot project that involves youth in the future of clean transportation and facilitates bold transformations in transportation in and surrounding K-12 schools. The intent is to green school districts with clean school buses, white fleet, which is like food delivery trucks, car sharing, bike sharing, lawn and garden equipment, charging infrastructure, and educational components, funding cross-sector approaches to clean transportation and providing benefits that can be replicated across communities statewide. Each project also aims to gain a better understanding of mode shifting and what the school districts can do to incentivize the shift to cleaner and active modes of travel, which involves deepening understanding of community needs to affect behavior change. Clean Mobility in Schools awarded 3 grants in its first solicitation in fall 2019 for projects in Monte, Stockton, and San Diego. CARB is now in the process of continuing to award proposals from the first solicitation that CARB did not have funding for the first time around, which includes 1 new grant with the Twin Rivers School District in Sacramento. Similar to Clean Mobility Options, this slide provides some data on the Clean Mobility in Schools grants. Won't go through everything here, but we are excited to share lessons and stories from this pilot more in the future as we continue to implement it. All right, last active pilot here for me is STEP, the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project. It's a transportation equity pilot that has 3 goals: address community residents' transportation needs, increase access to key destinations, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It pursues these goals by funding planning, clean transportation, and supporting projects in disadvantaged and low-income communities. It's a competitive grant program administered directly by CARB that provides a source of funding for larger projects than are funded by the Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program. It also provides a lot of flexibility to fund projects that address community residents' needs and encourages grantees to prioritize community involvement and decision-making in every stage of project planning and implementation. STEP awarded 11 grants in its first solicitation in summer 2020, which was extremely oversubscribed. CARB is now in the process of continuing to award proposals from the first solicitation that CARB did not have enough funding for the first time around. And CARB is also providing technical assistance to STEP grantees through 2 contracts, one for implementation grant support and one for planning and capacity building grant support. STEP funds large-scale grants that each house multiple clean transportation and supporting projects tailored to address specific needs identified by community residents. For example, through the STEP implementation grant for the City of Commerce, STEP is funding the city's first Class 2 bike lane, new electric buses and shuttles for expanded dial-a-ride and fixed route service, a tree planting project that helps clean the city's air and encourages pedestrian activity, a transit-oriented development and displacement avoidance plan for a neighborhood cited for a new light rail station, and outreach and engagement events meant to encourage clean transportation use and involve residents in the STEP projects. Like the previous pilots, this slide provides some data on the STEP grants, and the STEP webpage provides the location of each grant and a description of each grantee. This visual represents CARB's planning and clean mobility investments since fiscal year 2014-15. And we've also identified where there are planned future investments for clean mobility in schools and STEP with fiscal year 21-22 funds. So I'll just leave this up for a second so you all can actually digest it.
As mentioned, CARB aims to support the green economy and economic recovery through workforce training and development investments. Through these investments, we can directly address SB 350 barriers report community needs identified for access to training and programs that facilitate the transition of our workforce to zero emission. The goals for these investments are to work in partnership to expand opportunities for light and heavy duty training and to make the workforce a priority for clean mobility equity investments to support future needs. One key mechanism is working with the California Energy Commission to implement the Ideals of Workforce pilot project in priority communities. In June 2021, the Ideals of Workforce pilot project interagency agreement was executed with the California Energy Commission. CARB contributed $1 million towards this effort. In July 2021, we held our first public work group to discuss workforce training and development as part of clean mobility investments. Additional discussions will take place through the spring to basically determine how we move forward with the board approved $1.5 million for fiscal year 2021-22 investment, including expanding dealership training for new and used zero emission vehicles and adult and vocational school program partnership. An announcement will be released soon with more information on Ideals of Workforce pilot project awardees, so keep an eye out for that. Similar to our other investments, workforce projects are intended to provide 100% investment in priority communities. Ideals of Workforce will be active and operational in the spring or summer of this year. Our other efforts with the $1.5 million could be active as soon as mid to late 2022. The SB 350 Barriers Report prioritized expanding assessment of priority populations, clean transportation, and mobility needs, founded on the principles of engaging with leaders and community organizations to build trust and incorporate feedback into transportation and land use planning and investments. Understanding unique community transportation needs is a critical step in identifying barriers, as well as opportunities and solutions best suited to meet the unique needs and to increase access. We launched 2 projects that advance equitable community-based transportation planning, the Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program and Sustainable Transportation Equity Project that Bree covered. In 2020, 32 projects were awarded to nonprofits, local government, transit agencies, and Native American tribal governments to conduct local planning efforts. Partnering with UC Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute further supports the 350 goals of expanding and improving needs assessments through third-party evaluation, as well as developing strategies and recommended policies for inclusion of traditionally left out communities. Our goal is to promote broader impact beyond our clean mobility investments by fostering participatory evaluation spaces. Supporting under-resourced communities to build successful projects that are more sustainable is really key to meeting our equity goals. This includes gathering and considering lessons and outcomes from ongoing efforts, including technical assistance, outreach, and other activities. Based on stakeholder input and due to the complexity of the Sustainable Transportation Equity projects, CARB recognized a need for technical assistance to support applicants during the solicitation period and grantees during grant implementation. CARB funds this technical assistance through 2 contracts, one with the Strategic Growth Council that has a team led by Estelano advisors, and one through the Othering and Belonging Institute. Technical assistance has been particularly critical for planning grants and helping grantees learn about and incorporate equitable practices into their work. The same holds true for our CMO program. The Clean Mobility Equity Alliance is part of the Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program technical assistance and network building. It's a forum to bring mobility project and needs assessment funding recipients together in one place to support knowledge sharing and address issues and barriers. So please stay tuned for more information on this exciting effort. Access Clean California funded 6 small community-based organization partners to conduct community-centered outreach on CARB incentive programs in some of the hardest to reach communities of the state. Through this effort, Grid Alternatives built community-based organization capacity through one-on-one coaching, workshops, and networking events. Also, just want to mention, they did place 6 full-time fellows at partner organizations, which really helped to pilot workforce development strategies. The board approved $1 million in fiscal year 2021-22 funding for technical assistance and capacity building grants for community-based organizations. We will be hosting work group meetings in the coming months to discuss how to implement this funding. We have critical thought partners in the University of California, Berkeley's Transportation Sustainability Research Center, led by Dr. Susan Shaheen, as well as the Othering and Belonging Institute and broader research community, which will help to shape the long-term plan. For example, Dr. Shaheen's team is developing hypothesis-based evaluation process for us to assess the effectiveness and sustainability and outcomes of our clean mobility investments, which will result in policy recommendations in 2023 and a final report in the summer of 2024. The Othering and Belonging Institute is evaluating the success of Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program, as well as the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project, Clean Mobility and Community Transportation Needs Assessment Projects, respectively. Access Clean California was previously one-stop shop, just to make sure terminology is clear. Access is a multidimensional outreach project that streamlines access to and coordinates outreach for clean transportation and energy consumer-based equity projects. This project resulted from community desire to make incentives and information on these opportunities more readily available as identified in the SB 350 barriers report. The project's pilot phase focused on clean vehicle purchase incentive projects, including Clean Cars for All, financing assistance for lower income consumers, and clean vehicle assistance and rebate programs. The longer term vision, though, is to be a multi-agency platform that goes beyond vehicle purchase incentives. There are two major components, which are the web-based consumer-facing portal to streamline the application process and build a network of outreach partners. We're working with the grantee Grid Alternatives to further develop the portal, as well as expand the outreach partner network to include communities most impacted and marginalized. In the fall of 2021, the consumer-facing web portal to streamline the application process was made publicly available. This summer, we will be leveraging fiscal year 2021-22 funding to execute a new grant with Grid Alternatives for ongoing Access Clean California implementation. Some of the priorities for future funding and implementation include improving the benefits finder and expanding two additional incentive programs, supporting development and implementation of new projects for technical assistance and capacity building, and exploring areas of improvement for outreach and engagement with overburdened communities. Having multiple pilots does necessitate evaluating the impact to iterate and improve upon them and directly invest effectively to achieve the state's goals. Since mobility investments are equity focused, both qualitative and quantitative data collection and analysis is anticipated to help drive future funding decisions as well as policy, including for identifying priorities. CARB has and is continuing to conduct evaluations in a number of ways, and I just want to make sure to walk you through that. We obtain public feedback, like we are today, on the development and iteration of all of our clean mobility pilots through public meetings and one-on-one discussions. As mentioned, we also have 2 research contracts with UC Berkeley, with the Transportation and Sustainability Research Center and Othering and Belonging Institute, and we really highly value third-party pilot assessment. STEP's early technical assistance providers, Estelano advisors, surveyed applicants and non-applicants and developed an interim report outlining lessons from the first STEP solicitation. This report is available on the STEP website. In early 2021, the Greenlining Institute conducted an independent evaluation of the Air Resources Board, Energy Commission, and other clean transportation projects, and continues to work with us to incorporate standards for equitable community investment. That report is also available online. We rely heavily on data and feedback directly from our grantees and the users of implementing clean transportation projects to inform the direction of these pilots. There have been many critical lessons across our mobility equity investments. Documenting and sharing these lessons across project partners and with the public more generally is an important part of our process and will continue to be a focus of these discussions. In summary, our projects have demonstrated need beyond car share, including workforce training and cleaner technology at schools. We have seen an increase in the need for project flexibility, especially as implementation is getting off the ground and needs of communities change over time. Our projects do take time, much collaboration, and precious resources, and this is why we want to evaluate them, make sure they're providing intended benefits. One consistent theme has been the need for increased technical assistance for project applications, but also across the life cycle of implementation. CARB investments have always intended to provide necessary seed funding to help get projects started and build new concepts and ideas. But the goal is to make sure there is access to long-term and diverse funding streams to avoid stranding communities with services that will not continue. Some exciting news is that based on projects such as clean mobility in schools, there has been additional investment and commitment to funding and adopting zero-emission technologies beyond CARB grants. We've come a long way to build awareness of mobility programs, but there are still under-resourced communities that are not participating, so we know more needs to be done. We're up for that challenge and definitely open to new ideas on how we can better reach those who would benefit most from these investments. There are many other lessons that we've documented and shared for our projects, but we only included some key ones here to just help facilitate this discussion and frame our four-year planning. All lessons and outcomes for the four-year plan development will be considered. This plan will include lessons that drive community mobility strategy outreach efforts as well. Particular attention will be on lessons that help us understand and measure socioeconomic benefits and demographic impacts and transition from smaller scale pilots to a more comprehensive, streamlined, community-based program. Here we do have links to CARB projects and user information we have discussed with you today for your reference. To increase transparency and make information more widely available as we implement our projects, we'll continue to add and streamline information on our website. Before we move to the next agenda item, I do just want to take a pause here to see if there are any questions on introductory material.
Thanks, Ashley. Looks like we don't have any questions in the Q&A or any raised hands at this time. Maybe give it another minute.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sean.
Okay, I'm not seeing anything. I think we can move on.
Okay, so now we will provide an overview of the long-term plan for clean transportation investments, including requirements, the budget, as well as additional considerations. SB 1275 established many directives related to CARB's clean vehicle ownership programs, including for CARB to establish disadvantaged community-focused programs and include a long-term plan for the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project and related programs in fiscal year 2016-17 funding plan, with a long-term plan update every 3 years through January 1st, 2023. And when we say related programs here, that includes our clean mobility investments that we're discussing today. This work group meeting is our first step towards creating a long-term plan. Our goal is to take the lessons we've learned from implementing individual pilots and develop longer-term, community-based and centered programs that achieve substantive community benefits. While we always want to be learning and piloting different approaches to clean mobility in different communities through these investments, the long-term plan provides a critical opportunity to modify and improve upon our pilots. Based on the governor's draft January 2022 budget, CARB will have approximately $419 million over 4 fiscal years for clean mobility investments, starting with $65 million for fiscal year 2022-23. The long-term plan will include fiscal year 22-23 through 25-26 to be consistent with the draft budget. With the potential for 4-year funding certainty, we want to work with all of you to create a vision of what clean mobility investments should look like and the goals and priorities to inform our shorter-term investments. The 4-year plan will include more information on how these funds will be split across projects and if there are new opportunities we want to explore based on the assumption of future secured funding being available. As we move ahead with the 4-year planning process for clean mobility investments, there are some critical considerations we want to keep in mind to promote increased equity and inclusion in our investments, and also to facilitate necessary improvements to meet the needs of California's most under-resourced communities. A few key ones include collecting and sharing data and lessons learned through pilots and evaluations from grantees and our program participants, which is a focus of the audit report. Conducting dedicated and intentional outreach and engagement efforts that are community specific and meeting communities where they are. And leveraging existing efforts, such as the work conducted by the Greenlining Institute and CARB research projects to promote financial sustainability of clean mobility projects. Existing reporting on right-sizing expectations and requirements for grants, including first step, will be critical for our 4-year plan.
So we've included the definition of transportation equity here as defined in CARB's Sustainable Transportation Equity Project, because we've learned that it's important to have a common understanding of what transportation equity means, since CARB is working to further transportation equity through all of its clean mobility investments. So I'll just pause for a second so y'all can read this. For the long-term plan, we want to first start thinking about and getting your feedback on objectives for CARB's clean mobility investments. So on the screen here are some preliminary ideas that we've pulled together, building on the key priorities and lessons learned that Ashley mentioned earlier in today's work group meeting. Our overarching objective is to increase transportation equity, but we broke down the ways that we get there into objectives for our investments in priority populations and objectives for CARB's administration of these investments. So on the investment side, we want to increase access to key destinations. We want to reduce vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions. We want to identify and directly address community transportation needs. And we want to incorporate community-driven decision-making into project implementation. On the administration side, we want to streamline access to funds to maximize direct benefits to residents. We want to continue to document and share lessons learned for broader benefit. And we want to continue to evaluate our projects and look for opportunities to improve. So now here's where we get to your thoughts. We want to know, what are your goals for CARB's clean mobility investments? What do you agree with from the objectives on the last slide, and what do you think is missing? We've heard also in recent public work group meetings a sense of urgency related to COVID-19 and the economic downturn, and that we need to get projects on the ground now to meet existing needs. So we want to know how you think CARB can facilitate investments that directly address the impacts of COVID-19. So give you a second to think through your ideas for clean mobility investments. And I see we have some raised hands.
Bree, it also might be helpful too, after a second, to go back to the previous slide if folks have additional questions on that.
Okay, we have a raised hand from LaDonna Williams. LaDonna, you're free to
Yes, good
unmute
morning.
yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so LaDonna, good morning, everyone. LaDonna Williams, All Positives Possible in Richmond and Vallejo, California. So I had a couple of questions related to engagement, and I love the fact that you guys mentioned on your slides that community residents, you know, the focus is having the community residents have the power to make these decisions. But other than it just being on a slide and being mentioned, how do you really propose to do that? When I looked on the previous map, and it was kind of small, but we could make it out because you did color code it, so that was really helpful. But there were, in the beginning of the projects, in what was it, 2015 or 2014 or whenever you initiated the project to begin with, there was heavy focus in Southern California, not up here by the Bay Area. So we've got some major questions about how do you envision balancing the scales of the inequities that occurred up here when it came to, clean mobility. And the fact that when we look at UC Berkeley, although they're a great institution and they do lots of good things, when it comes to actually reaching the communities, the DAC, disadvantaged, care, underserved, all of the above, but the communities that tend to be left out of the process. There are a couple other names in here that you guys mentioned with UC Berkeley. I won't mention them because I don't want to really throw folks under the bus, but what I am telling you is they have not reached the communities and the residents that need these projects the most. So in addition to the fact that we have been really riding OEHA on their Cal Enviro screen, even the updated version especially has failed to list and include the communities that are the most overburdened and undersourced and supported. So I'm just wondering, through the upcoming focus and activities that you're planning, how are you really envisioning including communities that are severely disadvantaged in the process? You can't rely on the go-tos, and I saw that you guys are going to extend your contract with the previous entities that you have contracted with, I guess, to be that guiding force. But looking at the numbers, particularly for Black folks, for African Americans in this process, we have and we continue to be the lowest supported. So how do you envision moving forward to include us in this process so we can increase our access to these programs?
First of all, LaDonna, I want to say thank you very much for your thoughtful insights and feedback here. We really appreciate your participation. So I'll take a stab at this and definitely open it up to some of my other colleagues who might want to add in as well. So first of all, yes, we're definitely wanting to continue to engage directly with residents. That is a key important facet of this long-term plan. So how we get there and how we actually do that, LaDonna, I would definitely love to have some ongoing discussion with you and other residents within your community to kind of hear some of your thoughts and ideas for how we potentially could structure the long-term plan in a way that better meets the needs of residents in your community. So that's a start.
Okay.
Also, just wanted to highlight as well. So on the previous slide, we tried to show that we're finding balance and not just relying on our traditional existing partners, because we know that's not going to get us all the way. So what I would recommend, if there are any specific suggestions on other entities or people who we should be talking to, we welcome that. I definitely think we're all receptive to hearing more thoughts and ideas there. Also, just wanted to mention that I do appreciate your comments on making sure that the African American community is included in the process. You're looking at the numbers. We're equally looking at that through our Clean Mobility Options Voucher pilot program, done some analysis, and I do think that there's more change that we foresee based on that work. Do my colleagues have anything else that they wanted to add? And again, thank you, LaDonna, for your feedback.
Thank you, Ashley.
The only thing I would mention is that what is really exciting to me is that with this 4-year budget, it provides us with a lot more opportunity to think farther down the road and provide more meaningful engagement with communities, especially Black communities. And as you mentioned before, a lot of the project funding had gone to Southern California, and that's accurate. We do have a couple projects in the Bay Area that have received funding or will be getting funding. Back then, we just tried to see if the pilots would work, and I think communities want them. But we've got a whole lot more work to do. So looking forward to working with you on this.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned there are projects that have been funded or will be. Do you know the ones that have been and compared to the ones that will be, and what those numbers are when it comes to African Americans? Because I'm just giving you an example of what happened, of course, in the past with then President Obama, where he enacted, when he first went into office, a Hispanic Education Excellence Program. They had 2 years, almost 3 years ahead of other minorities being able to access the Education Excellence Program, particularly African Americans. There were no extra support for them. So finally, after there was a lot of push on Obama's administration to include African Americans excellence because access to the excellence education program, they finally did it. But it was almost 3 years later, which then means the balance of fairness and inequities continue because you have such a jump start for one particular population and not the other, when the other one has been so more undersourced from the gate, from the jump start. So again, with this 4 years to do this, are African Americans gonna be a priority since they've been starting from the bottom and being the least resources and supported? There has to be a priority set for them to be able to catch up, so to speak, or to receive those needed resources and support so that they can have a fair chance.
So to be clear on, I think the last question is yes, we will prioritize getting funding to Black communities. Regarding the funding that has already gone to Black communities, I have to follow up with you on that. I do know one of our projects that was funded that is overseen by MTC, Metropolitan Transportation Commission, does have a component of it that is in Richmond, which is a Black community, a Black community that has received funding. But I'd have to follow up with you on the other projects that we've that I know funding has gone to them.
Yeah, I was gonna say we're familiar with MTC, and we are in Richmond, so
yeah,
that's why we know that it did not reach the populations the way that it should have. But moving forward, I'm glad and appreciate the fact that you said that African Americans will be a priority, and so those are definitely goals that needs to be clearly communicated when they do these webinars moving forward. But thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, LaDonna. We have another question from Jim Corboy. Jim, you're free to unmute your line. And
thank you. This is Jim Corboy with H2B2 USA. We're developing a hydrogen generation project in Fresno County in the Central Valley. Unlike the major population centers north and south, there is great demand for hydrogen in this community. We're in a qualified opportunity zone, a disadvantaged community. My questions are, how could we both contribute to and benefit from workforce training as we build this project for hydrogen generation? And what is the path to potential streamline access to funds for this project? And I guess the real question is, what would be the process of really drilling down below the level of this presentation to really learn more?
Thank you so much, Jim, for attending today and your great question. Again, I'll take a stab, welcome others to add anything I might miss. So first of all, just wanted to say that I definitely think what might be useful, given some of your questions on hydrogen and specifically connections to workforce training and development, that we have a conversation with the Energy Commission as well, because they have a lot of investments in that area. So want to make the right connections for you, Jim, with staff over at the CEC.
Well,
And also myself, Noemi Vitella, and Tabitha Willman here at CARB. We're focused on workforce training and development efforts as they relate to the discussion today. So that's a first start. You wanted to make sure there's streamlined access to the project and that we're really drilling down into the needs. And so I think that would be the focus of the conversation that we have specific to working with CEC and CARB on that going forward.
okay, and I should have mentioned, Ashley, that we are benefiting from a $4 million grant from the Energy Commission. Phase 1 of the project is about close to $9 million, and we're funding the balance with our internal equity capital. But we do have the award from the Energy Commission.
Well, that's great to hear, Jim. I'm glad to hear that. And I think we realize there's more work that needs to be done when it comes to workforce investments on both sides of our agencies. So I think we welcome that conversation further.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question from Kevin Hamilton. Kevin, you're free to unmute your line.
Hi, good afternoon. Kevin Hamilton, Central California Asthma Collaborative. Here in the San Joaquin, we have obviously some different, more complicated issues than the Bay Area or the Los Angeles Basin and San Diego. Ours are similar to actually the majority geographically of California, where we have metropolitan cities like Fresno that are the hubs of employment for most people, and certainly for medical care and shopping. And yet, because the workforce is focused also at supporting this massive agricultural engine, we have people living in communities that are isolated 40, 50 miles away from these metro hubs. We've had a couple of projects, as you mentioned before, one that has sort of moved itself to a different stage in the struggle to survive. I'm talking about Mayor Ray Leon's Green Materials Program, and another that has basically come to a halt. Charging infrastructure out there was damaged, and because that infrastructure was supported by this project and not the ownership of the county or any of the EVgo or other folks, the tree that hit it is still there and it's never been fixed. So, but both ran up against this thing that, well, this is great for the community. The community wants to use it, but the community is still poor. And so building infrastructure like this is very difficult without long-term investment on the part of the agency or whoever's going to invest. These towns have anywhere from 900 to, in the South Valley and Kern, say 18, 19,000 people. They're never going to make that amount of money in these projects to be able to fully sustain the project. So I would just suggest, and I would ask if this is in the future here for these big regions that really do want to move in this direction. People are tired of driving this, 1 hour, hour and a half to work and back every day in old cars that often break down, that are that put them one broke down car away from unemployment and maybe even losing their homes. So, what's the strategy here for the future? Is it possible within these future projects to talk about and develop some kind of financing mechanism moving forward? Are there any ideas around what those kinds of financing mechanisms might look like? I know Green Materials has looked at and we've been talking with them about the idea of medical transport, but we don't want to devolve into just a medical transport type of organization. We've got all these people that need to get to work primarily, and then on top of that need to go shopping. where there's an actual grocery store and then not just a local quick mart. So any thoughts there on that?
Evan, thank you so much for your comment. I have my colleague Bree here too that looks like she wanted to say something. But first, just wanted to mention that I do think we're thinking along the same lines you are. So thank you for especially bringing up the financing mechanisms piece of the challenge. I think that's something we will be focusing on more here. We actually do have a specific research project that's going to be looking at potential tools that we might be able to leverage to overcome that. And we do have a link, which I'll send to you if you're not familiar. That's something that we're focusing on in partnership with our Sustainable Transportation and Communities group. Bree, did you want to add something there?
No, I think you covered it. But there was a lot in that comment. So, we'll follow up if we're not sure if we got everything, Kevin.
Okay.
I think we want to move on to the next section to make sure that we have enough time to get your feedback on the other parts of this effort. But we did hear some really helpful feedback on how we need to, how we might reframe some of our objectives. We heard financing questions, we heard investment in workforce, and we heard prioritizing investment in Black communities and, stating that up front.
Okay, so we don't want to leave stranded assets out there
Yeah.
from empty projects. That's just, and that's what we've got with one of these projects at this point, and that just needs to not happen, right?
Yeah, we agree.
All right. Fair enough.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
it's a huge challenge that we're working through. So
Yeah, it is.
yeah, but it's something we want to, not worsen with this next round of investments. So we do need to think through it now. I just want to encourage everyone, even if we're moving on, if you have other ideas on things that we should be prioritizing here, if you're supportive of any of these objectives that we have on the screen or think that they need to change, we want to hear from you. Chat your comments in the Q&A box. Even though it's called a Q&A box, we'll take comments and we will consider them even if we haven't had a chance to verbally address them. And then you can always email Ashley or myself with more ideas. The more that we hear from you, the more feedback that we get, the more our programs can be reflective of what the state of California needs. So thank you in advance for that. And Ashley, take it away.
So as we just discussed, community outreach and engagement will be central to the long-term planning efforts to share this process broadly and also understand how we can meet the unique community needs that we just heard about earlier. So to fulfill this objective, we plan to develop a long-term plan outreach strategy that meets communities where they are and incorporates the ideas that we just heard earlier today. This will follow best practices as we have already outlined in the Senate Bill 350 strategic outreach roadmap, but also consider lessons from ongoing project outreach and partner engagement as well. Specific elements we want to consider as part of the outreach strategy are public meetings, but we realize that won't get us there. So we want to have one-on-one calls and one-on-one engagement to better leverage those opportunities to seek community input. But we also have the website, and we want to find ways to collect ongoing feedback that way. Because to be honest, that's an opportunity for information to be more readily shared than what we might be able to accomplish in a public setting like this. The goal is to take a thoughtful approach of working with existing, but I want to emphasize, and new partners and networks, bringing non-traditional groups and organizations to the table. And we really want to make sure that folks are getting the benefit from greater participation in these investment discussions. For example, we hope to elevate equity expertise across our thought partners. And we also see that there are opportunities to leverage Access Clean California and their network to share ideas on the long-term plan and mobility priorities, but also the community folks that we heard from earlier today. We anticipate outreach will have a strong focus in the second long-term plan work group that we plan to hold in mid-April So we're really excited to hear your ideas on that in the interim. So much like before, we just provided a brief overview of our preliminary thinking for outreach. And now we want to hear from you. If you do have any additional thoughts from what was shared earlier, what's missing from the outreach strategy? What outreach should CARB really be prioritizing? And how can CARB maximize outreach, especially in those hardest to reach communities? And I love that that's a theme from today, because I really think that's important, especially rural, tribal, the African-American communities, to LaDonna's point earlier. So what can we do to maximize that outreach? Also, Bree, if you don't mind, after you kind of take a look at these questions, let's go back to the previous slide so that you can see some of the elements that we think will be part of this outreach plan.
And real quick, I guess my camera's not working, otherwise I'd be on video. I just want to be clear on one thing that gets really, really fuzzy. The funding plan has two separate processes. One is when the governor's budget and the legislature come up with a budget, we go through a process for the funding plan and we do outreach for that. And we describe larger overall programs and policy changes. Once the board approves our plan, then we also have what we call implementation work groups. And in those work groups is where we really get down into the weeds of particular project criteria, how we do outreach, who we do outreach to. That being said, both of those, in my opinion, both of those sets of outreach and engagement needs to be really improved. So, but I just want to clarify that they're two different sets, and we get, like, I guess, a number of different shots to come up with our plan and then adjust and reassess our plan as we're moving along.
So are there any thoughts or ideas on this process, or anything that you think might be missing?
So we have
Sean, any raised hands or questions?
Yes, we have a raised hand from Christopher Chavez. Christopher, you're free to unmute your line.
Yes, this is Chris Chavez with Coalition for Clean Air. First of all, thank you for this presentation, and I appreciate hearing many of the thoughts that you've expressed and ideas and goals. I also want to thank the participants who have provided their insights as well. I think, thinking back to what LaDonna Williams was saying earlier, I think the biggest thing is really meeting people where they're at in terms of outreach. And that includes and it means working directly with local CBOs, community-based organizations, and trusted community leadership in reaching out to these communities. My mind goes to, in particular, some of the efforts happening in the San Joaquin Valley through their auto scrap and replacement program, or even in the South Coast region, the Empower program down in this area, which is a broad effort amongst multiple different community-based organizations in reaching out to the community. I think being able to really focus those efforts in working with, again, those community leaders is important, because a lot of these folks, either aren't even aware of some of these agencies that are responsible for administering these programs, but also, there's also not the same level of trust. I know that one time I posted to my cousin who was looking for a car. I said, hey, there's this program that our local air district offers that helps replace cars with cleaner models. And I put the link, it was some odd, godly long link, and they thought I had been hacked. And they didn't trust it, and ultimately, unfortunately, got an internal combustion vehicle, a regular internal combustion vehicle. So I think just really doing a bigger effort to meet people where they're at, working with trusted folks in the community, working with trusted leaders in the community, is going to be very important for reaching hard to reach populations, and particularly communities of color and low income communities, because again, there is an understandable, I think, perhaps understandable distrust of some of the agencies that are involved with the process, or just a general distrust of government agencies in general. So just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it. We definitely concur on the importance of working with local community-based organizations and trusted leaders. I think we sort of touched on that potentially even before you joined this morning, but I definitely want to emphasize that as well. Wanted to also mention something which we found, which is not every community has a community-based organization. So that's also a challenge we have to work through. When we talk about underserved and underrepresented, there is also that element as well. And yeah, thank you for your ongoing feedback. We look forward to hearing your additional ideas, Chris, as this unfolds. But I definitely feel like elevating, meeting communities where they are is an important theme for this long-term plan. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple more raised hands here. Lonnie Mason, your line is unmuted.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for answering my comment. My name is Lonnie Mason. I'm the Executive Director of First Generation Environmental Health and Economic Development based out of the Bayview Hunters Point community. And I appreciate the effort of CARB, reaching out and saying that their priority is going to be the underserved, disadvantaged community. What I would like to say is this: we have sat at the table with CARB on various occasions, being promised that the African American community was going to be priority. But then what happened is other groups will get funded and our community is overlooked. Now, we know there's been an audit. CARB had an audit, and in that audit, there were some things said. And so we're wondering if we're going to be left out again. And, the same thing with the Air District. Sat at the table with the Air District many times. And they've done the same thing. And so they overlooked us. Funding was given elsewhere. And we're not saying that other organizations or other ethnic communities shouldn't receive funding for their community. But we're just saying that it needs to be a fair assessment here. And we're continuing to be overlooked in these processes, just like it was said in the audit. So I know you guys are aware of the audit and what was said. I don't need to go over that and explain anything in regards to that. But I'm just reiterating some of the things that have happened in our community. And not only just in the Bayview Hunters Point, and as Ms. Williams said, you have Richmond, you have Vallejo, you have various other, Rodale, other, communities that are being overlooked, African-American communities. So I want to know, is it going to be a priority this time around? And hopefully the money doesn't go to the middle class, as what was stated in the audit, because they received the majority of that money. And in the Bayview Hunters Point community, we haven't seen anything. No benefits in regards to these feedbacks in regards to these electrical vehicles. Nothing has come through our community in regards to this. So I just wanted to, are you serious about this? Are you going to reach out to us? Are we going to be able to, because you said leverage and they will form new partnership. Are you going to form those new partnerships to get this done? Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lonnie, for your time and comments as well. We greatly appreciate it. And yes, we definitely want to make sure to work with you and your community on this. And I feel like that's going to be an ongoing effort as well, not just through this long-term plan, but generally as part of our broader suite of investments. We look forward to that. Also wanted to elevate your comment on making sure there's a fair assessment and making sure that your communities are not overlooked. We agree with you, and we definitely want to work with you to figure out how that might be accomplished. We'd love to hear from you more on that. So thank you. Look forward to continuing to work with you, Lonnie. And if there are any other ideas that you have, based on what you saw in the audit, based on what you've heard so far, please feel free to reach out to us anytime.
Okay, we have another question from LaDonna Williams. Your line is unmuted.
Yes. Good morning, LaDonna Williams again, all positives possible. It's not a question, it's more of a comment. I appreciate the charts that you guys put up because it does give clarity. It helps, break down your programs in focus. And a lot of those I absolutely agree with. I think you guys are on track trying to address the issue. So I do want to commend you for that. There was also another slide, but it went by pretty fast and it didn't really stand out. But I think you mentioned, especially for disadvantaged communities, was the need for driver's license. And I just wanted to, expand on that a bit, that that needs to be one of the elements that will really support disadvantaged communities because of driving while Black, which are literal issues that our communities are dealing with. In particular, Solano County was actually sued, I believe, in 2017 for the fact that they had pretty much targeted African Americans revoking their driver's license for various infractions, but it, affected their ability to even be able to drive. Now, I know there is a homelessness, they call it homeless program in Contra Costa County. I believe it's in Alameda. Solano is kind of slow to enacting it, but my point being is that is an area I think CARB through this process can really be helpful. And of course, it'll be upon our community groups that do engage in this process to ensure that we're getting adequate funding. And what the homeless program does, for folks that are not familiar with it, is it helps reinstate driver's license that have been either revoked or suspended. There are judges that are in place that overlook the cases, and the fines can be from $5 to $500,000, and they help wipe out those fees, giving the person an opportunity for a second chance. And they don't just, wipe it out and there's no accountability. There are things that has to be done. And I think it's a good thing, because if they just wipe it out, then they're going to have reoffenders. But the program is in place to really help people get a new start on life, as well as, that compounding with what is presented with these clean technologies that we're doing, I think, to really make that a priority within these programs would be very helpful as well.
Thank you, LaDonna. I'm just loving your perspective and that tie that you just made to needing a driver's license for some of our mobility services. I personally didn't even think in that about the homeless population and what that means. So this is a really important connection. I definitely also just wanted to mention the fact that I'm glad that the charts and the graphics and things that we're providing today are useful. We tried to take a different approach. Happy to make sure that that information is more widely available, even outside of our work group discussions. But thank you. This is really great. And I'd love to hear more about the homeless program and what kinds of connections CARB should be making based on those efforts.
Okay, we have another question from Camille Williams. Camille, your line is unmuted.
Hi, just a quick comment. and I'm with Othering and Belonging Institute. I didn't see on the networks any organization representing the disability community. And so I'm wondering, is that being considered in this outreach and engagement process?
Excellent point, Camille. Thank you for bringing that up. That is absolutely something we need to be thinking about. It's a focus of one of our pilot projects that I mentioned to you earlier, Lifeline Paratransit, but I think more holistically should be a consideration as we're thinking about the longer term of our investments. Great comment.
I'll just mention also that for this and other comments, like if you have any specific organizations that you think we should be reaching out to, or like existing networks of organizations, please chat those in, or you can email us separately about them so we can, start creating that list and making sure we're getting at all these different types of communities.
Okay, we have another question from Kevin Hamilton. Kevin, your line is unmuted.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo this idea of not just reaching out to community-based organizations. And I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said a lot of communities, especially that we work with, don't have a community-based organization. We often find and are working with core community-based organizations that actually work with multiple communities in their counties. And it's important to know who those are. There's in the Valley, for instance, there's been a clean vehicle equity coalition that's been meeting of 9 organizations spread across the region that work with, each group is working with as many as 7 or 8 local communities in their counties that they have long-term relationships with. I think the biggest barrier that I've seen though for this particular program is even that group doesn't understand it, doesn't really understand how it would help their communities and how to access it. So I would really suggest if there's a possibility of putting forward an education effort or funding to a couple of community-based organizations who could go out to those communities and help them understand this program, create some kind of a slide deck or show that would, really, that can be shared in multiple language formats, that would help these communities understand what these programs mean, especially in local unincorporated communities where a lot of really great organizations are working, like Central California Environmental Justice Network and Leadership Council and others. And that education needs to happen. It's hard to just land in a community and say, oh, hey, we've got this clean mobility options program. It's a wonderful thing. It's going to get you, to work, or you're not going to have to worry about that car, breaking down because we've got this asset here. It's going to happen for you. What does that mean? I think there's a lot of education that still needs to be done here around these programs. So if that's possible to build in here, I'd love to see that.
Thank you, Kevin. We concur with the educational component, and the building awareness element is absolutely essential for any of what we discussed today to happen. That's really at its core. Also, just wanted to mention too, you talked about funding for community-based organizations, and that is something our agency is really looking into, how we can direct fund community-based organizations through things like our technical assistance and capacity building efforts. So definitely appreciate all the feedback here, Kevin, and look forward to following up with you further on that. And Tab, did you want to add anything specific?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Tabitha Willman. I'm the manager of our Clean Transportation Outreach section here at CARB. And I just want to say, I really appreciate all of the comments. And I think, Kevin, absolutely, there's still a huge, there's so much work to do. And I think that's part of it. Like, where do we focus and where do we put our energy and our resources? But we definitely need to ramp up, the number of communities that we're working Lonnie and LaDonna, I have been thinking about what you all said, because you said the same thing, and you've been saying it for a long time, but I heard it a couple of weeks ago at one of the workshops. How are we looking at the communities and the racial demographics and who we're missing? And I think that's, some of the maps that we're starting to put out and actually put together is like thinking about how do we figure out who these are. And first off, it's being responsive to the folks like you who are telling us that your communities are being left out. So, I think I would love to talk with you all more about how we can do that. Who are other communities that you see are being left out? And then we need to be more proactive in figuring that out also. I think another thing is, trying to work more closely and expand our direct outreach to communities. And I know that we've got, and that's something that we're looking at, and something that we're going to be talking about coming up in the next few months is like, how do we change the way that we're doing things or make adjustments so that we can more direct fund community organizations, provide better education and outreach. One of the pilots we've been doing has been looking at offering fellowship opportunities to under-resourced CBOs and trying to help educate communities in the way that those CBOs do business with the communities on the topics, on clean mobility and what CARB has to offer, and how, what we're doing, whether it's a regulation or an incentive program, impacts the community. So I just wanted to jump on and say that I absolutely appreciate all of the comments, and I think there will be opportunities to dive more deeply into some of what you all are suggesting and recommending. And I know I would love to have more conversations. So thank you so much for your feedback.
Okay.
Okay, Sean, just so you know, I think we have time for that one more raised hand, and then we want to move on to make sure we get feedback on the last section.
Sounds good. This last question is from Shiva Baumik. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I'm using a completely different laptop, so I didn't know if it would go through. Thank you very much. I always learn tremendously whenever I listen to California-related events. Thanks again, Ashley and Bree, for carrying us through some excellent presentation here. I think some of the comments that we heard from many of the commenters so far, I think, especially from the disadvantaged communities and the compromised sections of society, may have to do with California leveling the playing field to a certain extent, and it also has to tie in not just into communities, but also in the corporate sector too. Without getting in the corporate aspect of it, maybe I can touch on a few topics here. It also relates to some of the educational aspect we found in our outreach to the early stages of the AB 617 communities. There was not much of awareness of the programs in certain of the communities, some segments of the community. So that needs to be probably helped a little bit from the state side. And also at the other side, which is the leveling the playing field aspect of it, I think what we are finding is that most of the resources are either getting allocated to people that have already been funded in the past, or communities that are fully engaged in the process, and the disadvantaged and the low-income communities are not being able to leverage the funds as much. So I think many others have already talked about it. So on a strategic basis, I think the state has to probably figure out how to level the playing field in that sense, both in terms of education and also in allocation of funds. And then finally, just to touch on the topic of the corporate side, a lot of these existing technologies that are coming to market, which are exorbitantly expensive and burdening society over and over again, needs to be solved with innovation. And so I think California needs to take the lead, because the world is watching, and you are obviously at the forefront of bringing new innovation and technologies to market. So I can only implore that California takes a lead with viewing with innovation and also targeting smaller and more innovative companies as opposed to always being engaged with the large corporates. Thank you very much for giving me the time to talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiva, so much for participating today and providing that great feedback. I agree on the need to kind of level the playing field and really promote the educational aspects of all of our programs and projects. And also, I just wanted to emphasize that I really think what you mentioned about allocating funding to projects that already received funding is an important thing to mention. And that's something we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about where the gaps are, conversely, where have we not been providing funding, as you heard earlier, and continue to really take a lead and be bold, especially as we're embarking on something exciting like this with 4 years of funding opportunity. That's just, it's a great opportunity for us all to work together on that front. So thank you. We appreciate the comments.
All right, so we'll touch on this last section, and remember, like, if you have other ideas about the outreach we should be doing, chat those in. If you leave your email, we can follow up with you also individually. So there is an increasing need to identify and implement clear, measurable metrics to assess and track the progress of our clean mobility investments. And some of CARB's key focus areas are greenhouse gas emission reductions, socioeconomic benefits like increasing access to key destinations, and the demographic data on project participants and implementers. For example, Clean Mobility in Schools has started collecting data on socioeconomic benefits via participant surveys and direct participant feedback, and metrics being measured are things like user satisfaction and vehicle trip types. We'll get into more detail on how we're evaluating our current clean mobility projects in the next public work group meeting. But in the meantime, one of the things that we have to do for this long-term plan is for clean mobility investments is to develop projections on the need for these types of clean mobility projects over the next 4 years. We'll be pulling a lot from data that we've already collected. So from solicitation feedback, surveys of applicants and grantees and people that didn't apply to our programs, third-party evaluations and reviews, interim project reporting, all of the feedback that we've been getting from stakeholders in the interim. But we also want to hear your ideas right now for how to measure the need for CARB's clean mobility investments. We'll be referencing tools and resources that are already available to us throughout this process, and specifically those that promote more equitable community investments. Among those are the Greenlining Institute's 6 standards of equitable community investment, which are summarized on this slide. And now, again, we want to hear your ideas. So given our focus on transportation equity and providing benefits to priority populations, what metrics should CARB focus on to help estimate the need for these clean mobility investments over the next 4 years? And how do you measure progress to understand where clean mobility projects are delivering their, and if clean mobility projects are delivering their intended benefits?
Okay, we have a raised hand. Camille Williams, your line is unmuted.
Hi. One of the areas or one of the metrics, I think, or a couple of metrics can be one, I'd say the wealth gap. If you truly invest in these low income and underrepresented communities, and provide workforce development, let's just say with ZEBs, for example, training and operating ZEBs and how to maintain ZEBs. And if they're given that opportunity to learn new skills, is there an increase in household wealth in those communities? When you look at health disparities, have there been improvement in health disparities? Asthma, for example, is a huge problem in certain communities. So one way would be to assess the current whatever the current metrics are in that particular community, the existing conditions, regarding household income, regarding health disparities, regarding educational attainment, regarding home ownership or car ownership, and then compare that to future metrics, like how has any of that changed? And that's it.
Thank you. Those are great ideas.
Okay, we have a question from Kevin Hamilton. Kevin, your line is unmuted.
Not a question. It says I'm muted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Just this is the toughest part, I think, for you guys and for everyone is, this measurement piece. So I think going in, you've got to, in communities, I think one of the first things to do is find out what they know about these programs. After somebody has done work to raise awareness about them. I think that should be measured at every point along the way. Do people understand this program and are they interested in it? Do they feel it would be useful? So that's always definitely worthwhile. And then, checking in regularly along the way, again, in these same places where the work is being done to reassess that. Is it still doing what you need it to do? What could it do better? So I think for to meaningfully measure the, sorry, this thing's in my way here, the quick Q&A box, meaningfully measure progress and assess outcomes. That's critical. So we want to know how people feel about it. Is this something that's working for them? And then as far as the indicators in bullet 1, I think definitely socioeconomic benefits, local wealth, certainly quality of life. They're going to be more subjective. It's tough to get objective data out of something like that. Are people more inclined to use this resource rather than their own vehicles? Has this resource allowed them to stop using a personal vehicle or significantly curtail that? So I think, again, sitting down and working that out is critical to do ahead of time, obviously, your evaluation, but that would be some of the ways to measure that. And then overall, as far as where CARB is getting this done, is getting this out there, so where are you being successful? And again, a survey of communities that you feel that you've had been doing work in and been doing successful work. Is that true? So we're always checking ourselves. I got to check myself. We have to check our organization. Are we really doing? Are we succeeding? We think we are, but do the people we're working with think so? If they don't think so, it doesn't really matter what we think. So, figuring out how to do that is always challenging, but you have to be able to be willing to take a hit at that point and use that information to do better the next time. So I don't think that's really been done with this program. If it has, I don't know about it. I'd love to read the report. But again, that would involve a lot of proxy work, sending people out into the communities and talking to them and collecting that information. It's hard to collect information like that in aggregate. I think from things like census and finance data and things like that's really, really very difficult. If you've got an in on that makes it easier, I'd love to hear it. In small communities, you might be able to because the populations are so small, but really it's more subjective than that. It's do the people in those communities, are they using it? Do they feel it benefits them? If so, in what way? Those are the questions that need to be asked. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a lot of helpful thoughts for us. And I think that you're right that not a lot of the evaluation that we need to do has been done yet. And we're starting to do more of it kind of on a project by project basis. So we will talk more about that in the next public work group meeting. But I think, we all know that we're a little bit behind on this piece and we need to spend a lot of time on it this time around. Sean, are there any other raised hands? Otherwise, we can move on to next steps so we have time for any wrap up questions.
No more raised hands. Oh, we just got a question in the Q&A from Michael Lumbley. It says, I was hoping we would hear more about the workforce training component. As a small business owner who will be opening a DC fast charging stations throughout SoCal, I would very much like to learn how we would work with the programs to train and hire local technicians and service personnel, but shouldering the cost is formidable.
Yes, thank you, Michael. It's nice to meet you. Thanks for participating today. I'd look forward to chatting with you more on this. I definitely think this would be a good example of something that we can discuss one-on-one so that you have a better sense of the kinds of programs that are already available that you might be able to tap into.
Okay, I think we can move on.
Thanks, Sean.
So here we have upcoming meetings to support development of the fiscal year 2022-23 funding plan for clean transportation incentives and our long-term plan. We wanted to give you all the information in one place. Earlier this week, we released a notice for the first funding plan workshop March 15th and really hope that you all will be able to participate. We plan to hold 2 more clean mobility long-term plan focused work group meetings, one in mid-April to share a proposal and one in late May to work with all of you to finalize that proposal ahead of the final funding plan workshop in the summer. We anticipate other entities, including third-party evaluators and others that we mentioned earlier on in today's presentation, will play a more prevalent role in future work group discussions. We are also holding 2 additional light-duty focused work group meetings to discuss creating a sustainable and equitable ZEV market and CARB's light-duty electric vehicle purchase incentive programs in late March and late May. The governor's revised budget is expected in late May, and staff will be holding various public meetings into the summer. All of this culminates with the release of our proposed fiscal year 2022-23 funding plan, with the long-term plan included, for consideration at a late 2022 board meeting. So at this point, just wanted to check in with everyone. Are there any additional questions or comments, whether it's on our upcoming meetings or any of the other material that we've covered with you all today?
We have a question in the Q&A from Loretta Eard. When do you anticipate a call for projects?
So I'll start, but others can add. Well, I guess there are 2 things I'll note. One is that as far as the current pilots go, the Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program has an upcoming application window sometime this spring, late spring or early summer. So there will be more information coming out about the exact timing of that application window. So that's specifically for the Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program. Now, for these next 4 years of investments, we're trying to figure out, based on what we're hearing from you today and stakeholder input over the next 3-4 months, we're trying to figure out what these programs look like in the future. do we continue to have STEP, clean mobility options, clean mobility in schools? What gaps are they not filling right in their current forms? How can we improve them? And so until we know what the structure of those programs will look like, which is what we're working on over the next 4 months, we won't really have a good sense of what our anticipated timeline is. I guess I will also say that it definitely won't be before fall of 2022, because that's when we actually when our board would approve what the structure of these programs is going to be. Does that make sense? Ashley, do you have anything to add?
Nothing to add.
Okay, we have a raised hand from LaDonna Williams. Your line is unmuted.
Yes, LaDonna Williams again, all positives possible. I would like to ask the funding application itself, as you go through that process, do you know how many pages it currently is and what it will be when it, when folks have to apply? And the reason why I'm asking is I know in the past when we've had to apply for grants, they put in front of us an 80-page monster, is what we call it, of a proposal. And as small community groups, are already underfunded and understaffed and trying to figure out how to write an effective grant. And I can tell you ahead of time, going through a webinar with, a group explaining to you, reading off the contract, the proposal does not help. But looking at those proposals, have you also looked at streamlining the process so that it is not so overburdensome, or, the smaller groups just can't compete because they can't write a successful grant and word it or structure it the way that you guys require to even receive the funding?
Yeah, thanks for that comment and question, LaDonna. I will say that one of my personal goals is to reduce the complexity of our applications. I don't know which program you've had experience with, but I know that STEP is extremely complex. And in part, we want to kind of try to what I'm trying to call right sizing our expectations based on the amount of funds that we're giving. So some of our programs that are giving out smaller amounts of funds still have extremely complex applications, and we want to make sure that we're not putting so many burdens on the applicants that they can't even, that's the reason they can't access the funds. So we will be working on that, and we're very conscious of that problem. The structure of the application will come kind of after we identify what the programs will look like. And so hopefully we can continue to engage with you and others on that structure and make sure that it meets your needs.
And I would also add, LaDonna, thank you so much for your comment. I want to echo what Bree said. For Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program, this is one of our main goals for next window of application. And we've already done some improvements to shorten the application form. We're splitting it into 2-step applications. So the first round of application is really asking only for minimum eligibility requirements to hopefully, you don't have to invest too much of your time, writing that proposal and application when you don't know even if you would get funded at the end. So we totally understand that frustration with complexity of applications. So hopefully for our CMO program, this will look much better in the next round. And thanks for your comment again.
Okay, we have another question from Camille Williams. Camille, your line is unmuted.
Hi, and just to follow up on what LaDonna said, perhaps in this process, particularly in your community engagement component, that you can have a parallel process where you're working with the small nonprofits to help you develop a proposal packet that is manageable. They can help design through a community engagement process. They can help you design a proposal packet so that it makes it easier for them to compete with larger firms. And that might be a way. So when you get ready to do your call for projects, you'll have a proposal process in place that was actually developed by the small CBOs.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great idea. Ashley, you want to wrap up?
Sounds great to me. Sincerely, thank you all so much for your thoughts on clean mobility investments and the long-term plan process. We got so much out of this conversation. Really thankful to establish some new relationships as well. So we welcome additional feedback on our projects and the long-term plan. Please feel free to reach out to us anytime via the contact information that we provide you with here in Zoom. You're welcome to ask follow-up questions or have more in-depth conversation on any of our planning efforts or projects. Also, I always just have to remind folks, don't forget to subscribe to our listserv. That way you can make sure you're staying informed of everything upcoming. And I think that's really all that I have, but we're really excited to embark on this process and re-envision our equity investments with all of you. Thank you so much. And don't forget that the recording will be made available in approximately 2 weeks as well. Thank you so much, everyone. We hope that you have a wonderful day.